Part 1 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapters 1 to 3. In every land thy feet may tread, time like a veil is round thy head. Only the land thou seek'st with me never hath been, nor yet shall be. It is not far, it is not near, name it hath none that earth can hear. But there the soul shall build again memories long destroyed of men, and joy thereby shall like a river wander from deep to deep for ever. Dream Market. Chapter 1. Of the Hall of Sulney, and how Sir Ewan left it. Sir Ewan sat in the Hall of Sulney and did justice upon wrongdoers. And one man had gathered sticks where he ought not, and this was for the 20th time. And another had snared a rabbit of his lord's, and this was for the 40th time. And another had beaten his wife, and she him, and this was for the 100th time, so that Sir Ewan was weary of the sight of them. Moreover his steward stood beside him, and put him in remembrance of all the misery that had else been forgotten. And in the midst of his judging there was brought into the hall a child that had been found in the road, a boy of 7 years as it seemed, and he was dressed in fine hunting green, but not after the fashion of that day or country. Also when they spoke to him he answered becomingly, but in a speech that no one could understand. So Sir Ewan had him set by the table at his own side, and now and again as he judged those wrongdoers he cast a look upon the child, and always the child looked back at him with bright eyes. And even when there was no looking between them he listened to what was being said, and smiled, as though that which was weariness to others was to him something new and joyful. But as the hour passed, Sir Ewan felt his mind slacken more and more, and whenever he saw the boy smiling, his own heart became heavier and heavier between his shoulders, and his life and the life of his people seemed like a high road, dusty and endless, that might never be left without trespassing. And though he would not break off from his judging, yet he groaned over the offenders instead of rebuking them, and when he should have punished, he dismissed them upon their promise, so that his steward was mortified, and the guilty could not believe their ears. Then when all was said and done, the hall was cleared, and Sir Ewan was left alone with the boy. But the steward, looking slyly back through the hinges of the door, saw that his lord and the child were speaking together, and he perceived that they understood one another well enough, though how this should have come about he was not able to guess, having himself heard the boy answering to all questions in none but an outlandish tongue. Then he saw Sir Ewan rise up, and suddenly he was aware that his lord was calling for him loudly and with a hearty voice, as he would call for him long since when they were at the wars together. And when he went in, Sir Ewan bade him summon all the household. Now, when the household were come into the hall, they stood at a little distance from the dais, in the order of their service, and Sir Ewan stood above them in front of the high table. And beside him was the boy, and before him was his own brother, who was now an esquire grown, with hawk on wrist. Then Sir Ewan bade his brother kneel down, and there he made him knight, taking his sword from him and laying it on his shoulder, and afterwards belting it again round his body. And he took the keys from his own girdle and the gold spurs from his own feet, and said aloud, I call you all to witness that as I have done off my knighthood and the honour of Sulney, and given them to this my brother Sir Turquin, so also by these tokens do I deliver unto him the quiet possession of my house and goods, and the seisin of all my lands, to hold on to him and his heirs for ever, by the service due and accustomed for the same, and henceforth I go free. Then his brother, who was both glad and sorry, and moreover was still in doubt how this might end, stood holding the keys and the spurs, and looking at him without a word. And he looked also at the child, and he saw that for all the difference in their years, the eyes of Sir Ywain had become like the boy's eyes. And as he looked, his heart became heavy, and for a moment he envied his brother and feared for himself. But in his fear he moved his hands, and the keys clanked and the spurs clinked together, and his heart leapt up again for joy of his possessions. And all this Ywain saw as it were a great way off, and he smiled and forgot it again instantly. And the boy took his hand, and they went down the hall together. And when they came to the door to pass out, the steward got before them and bowed as he was used to do, and he spoke very gravely to Sir Ywain, reminding him that this same afternoon had been appointed among the lords, his neighbours, for the witnessing of certain charters. But Ywain and the boy looked at one another and laughed, and the steward saw that they laughed at the lords and at him, and at the very greatness of the business. And he was enraged and turned away and went to his new master. Then Sir Turquin came hastily after them, and he laid his hand upon his brother's arm, and bent his head a little, and spoke to him, so that none else should hear. And he said, "What is this that you are doing? For no man leaves all that he has, and departs suddenly, taking nothing with him." But those two went from him without answering, and they passed, as it seemed, very swiftly along the road under the woodside, and were hidden from him. And again, as he stood still watching, he saw them going swiftly above the wood, where there was no path, but only the bare wold before them. Chapter 2. How Sir Ywain saw his own face for the first time. Now the truth is that when Ywain turned his back on his old life and the snug lordship that was his, he had no thought of what was to be the way of his wandering, nor did he so much as know by which of the world's four roads he would begin his journey. But he climbed upon the open wold as if all his pleasure was to climb and to strike his feet firmly and to breathe deep. And the boy went by his side in like manner, and they spoke no word. But when they were come to the height of the slope, Ywain turned and looked down upon the homestead of Sulney, and he saw it small and clear under the midday sun, as like as may be to a toy that a child would play with. And there was no man moving about it, but only the white pigeons flying this way and that upon the roofs. And it was lovely to him, for he saw it as a time that is past. Then he looked a little farther, and he saw the broad road and dust kindling along it like smoke, and in the dust a great company riding. And they rode in order by two, and their jogging was heavy, and Ywain remembered that these were the lords who had appointed to do business with him. And because of them the place was no longer lovely to him, and he turned away and ran quickly over the ridge, and when he could see them no more he laughed. And the boy also ran and laughed, and their laughter was as though they were both truants from school, escaping narrowly with fear and joy together. And on the other side of the ridge they cast themselves down upon the grass, and among the grass were thistles, and the thistles pricked them sharply, and they rolled and were pricked again, and laughed again and yet again. Then they set their shoulders against a bank and sat still, looking to the country that was before them. On the one hand lay the sea near by, and upon it white sails of ships that were sailing marvellously, for though they were upon the sea, yet they sailed, as it seemed, high above the land. And on the other side lay a thick wood that hid all the far country, and before the wood was a village and a tower. And Ywain knew that village well enough, cot and lot, barn and balk, and he thought not at all of the village, but only of the wood and the great depth of it, and of what might be beyond. And so thinking he fell asleep. But when he awoke the sun was westering, and he looked again upon the village and saw it as though it were strange to him, and he could not remember even the name of it. Then he stood up and turned towards the place beside him where the boy had been. And as he looked he was astonished, for the boy was there still, sleeping as himself had slept. But his face was like the face of an old man, and the lines upon it were countless, like bird marks on the river sand. So Ywain stood staring for a while, and he said to himself, Now I know by the trouble in my head that either I have lost my wits as a man beat down in battle, or else in all this there is a meaning that I have known and forgotten, for it seems to be both reasonable and impossible. Then he touched the boy's hand and awoke him, and when he saw his eyes again he asked him, Who then are you? And the boy said, Answer me first the same question. But Ywain would not, for he said, Why must I answer first? And the boy said, Let be then, for you know already what you would answer, and there is but one and the same answer to your question and to mine. Then Ywain looked no more into the boy's eyes, but upon the ground, and bewilderment came upon him again, for he said in his heart, This that he says is madness, and yet I seem to know that it is true. And when he lifted his head again, he said to the boy, How can a man speak with himself face to face? And how can I, that am neither, be both an old man and a boy? But the boy answered him, Is not every man that which was and that which shall be? And in all the days of his life shall he not once or twice see the face of his desire? And as he spoke, Ywain heard him plainly, but now he saw him not so plainly, though he stood looking down upon him in the same place. And he said quickly, Tell me this then, what is my desire? And he heard again the answer as one that hears a voice through the mist. But the words were in an unknown tongue, and he peered down and stooped, and where the boy had been there was but the long grass and the thistles. And when he rose up again, he saw the hillside clear before him, and the sun was low, and the edges of the bents were glistening, and nothing moved among them but the wind of sunset. Chapter 3. How it fortuned to Ywain to find a staff in the place of his sword. Then Ywain turned his face towards the village, and went down the hill. And he went with a good heart, for though the boy had left him, yet he hoped not to be long without him. And even now, when he looked straight forward, it seemed that he had the joy of his company and his laughter. But when he turned and looked beside him, there was but his own shadow. Black it lay and long, and about the edges of it a brightness was shining. Then he remembered that the sun was low, and night rising among the hollows, and he bethought him of his supper and sleep. So he went quickly to the village, and passed through it, and came to the farmer's house that lay beside the great wood. And the farm-wife gave him welcome, as one that knew not who he was, but could well pitch her guess within a mile or so. And she whispered to her husband, but he was hard of hearing and full of slumber from the fields. So when Ywain had supped, they showed him where he should lie, and when he was come, there he laid him down, and the day went from him in a moment, and he knew no more whether he were alive or dead. But very early in the morning he awoke, and he saw that over against his face, as he lay abed, there was a window in the wall, and the window was open, and there came through it a small, sweet noise, for it was the time of sparrow chirp, which comes just before the rising of the sun. So he rose from his bed, and went to the window, and leaned with his arms upon the sill, watching for the day to turn from greyness to light. And as he leaned and watched, he heard a noise of talking in the house below, for the door was right there beneath him, and it stood open wide. Moreover, the talking was loud, for they that talked were the farmer and his wife, and she spoke loud because he was hard of hearing, and he spoke yet louder because she was his wife, and he wished his saying to prevail over hers. So she said in a high voice, As surely as an egg is an egg, by the same token this is my lord of Sulney. Then he spoke scornfully of her and her eggs, and asked her for what reason of all the reasons on earth should such a one as my lord of Sulney come to sup in a farmstead that was none of his, and sleep in a vile bed, when he had better within a bare league? And she answered quickly, that though a thing were clean past a man's understanding, yet it might well happen so for all that. And further, she would have him to know that in her house were no vile beds, but such as were fit for any man to sleep in, and she cared not who he might be. And at that he growled a little, like a dog that is made to cease barking. Then he spoke to her again, in the manner of one who deals with a child, making a show of gentleness and mastery together. "See now," he said, "and I will give you 3 reasons why you have the wrong and I have the right of it. First then, this one that has had supper and sleeping room of us is a young man, and quick to rise and sit down, but my Lord of Sulney is past his youth and waxing heavy. Secondly, this one came to us walking upon his own shanks, and that no lord would do that had the horses of Sulney, for I have seen them time and again, and in these parts there are none better. And beside these 2 reasons, there is a third that you might well have seen with your own eyes. For this man's cloak is the cloak of a pilgrim, and not of a lord, and his hat and staff are such as none use but wayfarers. And if you will not believe me now, you may ask him for the truth of it yourself." "That I will do," said the woman. Then Ywain fell into a study, for he saw that in despite of all those reasons her mind was not changed, but that she would certainly ask the truth of him, and it seemed hard to him to know what the truth might be, for he remembered how he had put off the lordship that was his, but he could not tell how he had become young, nor how he had lost his sword and come by the hat and staff of his pilgrimage, so that he thought at one moment, "I am that lord," and at another, "I am not," and his life past seemed like a dream of the night. And while he was still wondering, he went down the steps, and in the room that was below he saw the farm wife with bread for him to break his fast, and the man by the door. And against the wall he saw his hat and staff. And as he ate, the woman said to him, "Look you, sir, we are not used to keep guests that are unknown to us, but we knew you, that you are my Lord of Sulney." Then Ywain said, "I am not," and immediately the farmer slapped his hand upon his thigh and shouted at his wife. But Ywain saw the woman look at him, and he looked at her, and she smiled to him as to one that was bidding her keep a thing secret. And she said to her husband, "There is no need for you to shout, for an apple may have a red side and a green, and yet it is an apple to him that hath understanding." Then Ywain gave her thanks and took his leave of them both, and he went out into the sunlight and followed the path into the high wood. But he saw nothing of his way as he went, for all his thought was upon that answer which he had given, whereby he had answered others, but in no wise answered himself. End of part 1. Part 2 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 4 to 6. Chapter 4. How Ywain came to an hermitage in a wood. So Ywain marched alone in the high wood, and for a time he saw no more the sun, nor the light of the sun, for the wood was of pines, and they were marvellous thick above his head, but the stems were far enough apart, and the track went this way and that among them, and whiles it turned aside, and whiles it forked, and whiles it was no track at all. But Ywain went always right forward, and would not stay nor leave following his own thought. And as he went it came again into his mind that he was a new man, for though he was still amazed with questions, yet he carried neither forethought nor repentance. And he marched to a song that was in his ears, and in his marching there came to him the remembrance of the child that had led him forth. And though he knew surely that he was now alone, yet by the imagination of his heart he could well see the child dancing before him upon the path of the forest. And at last, when he had gone a long way, and could by no means tell how long, on a sudden he looked far before him, and saw the ground all fresh with grass, and no more pine needles upon it, but sunlight and shadow. And he went quickly forward, and came out from the dark wood, and stood in an open grove that was hoar with silver birches. And beyond the grove was a stream that ran burbling, and beyond the stream was a bank with great beeches upon it. So for delight of that place he turned and left following the path, and went along between the beech roots and the stream. As he went, the bank upon the right hand was ever higher and steeper, until there were no more beeches upon it. But by the stream was a bare lawn between this wood and that, and a little cliff thereby, as sharp as a cliff of the sea. Now the cliff was of red sand, and the face of it was carven curiously, for in it were 2 steps and a doorway, as it were the doorway of a church, and 2 windows of like fashion with a little mullion to each, so that Ywain knew it for an hermitage. And he sat down to look upon it, stepping back within the shadow of the beech trees, and when he looked it did him great good to see and to think upon it, for the house was small and secret, and though the carven work of it was but plain, yet it well showed the pleasure of him that had worked at it. Then the hermit came out from within, and when he saw him, Ywain kept close to watch what he would do, for he knew not the manner of hermits, nor how they live all their life days, seeing that they have time before them like new fallen snow, without fence or footmark. Now the hermit had bread in his hand, and Ywain hungered at the sight of it, for he had had none since the morning was early, and now it was late. And this he knew by the hermit's shadow, for it lay small and squat about his feet. Nevertheless he would not move, but kept still where he sat, for his desire to see was greater than his desire to eat, and he thought moreover that he might yet come to the eating after the seeing. So he looked and saw as he desired, for the hermit broke the bread and rubbed it in his hand, and threw the crumbs abroad upon the lawn. And instantly there came upon the place a dozen of small fowls, such as dunnocks and finches, and they hovered and hopped after the bread as long as he would throw it. And some part of it he would not throw, but he walked away from the birds and came to the stream, and held out his hand above a little pool where the water ran curdling. And Ywain knew that he was giving the remnant to the fish, and that they were by likelihood trout that came for it. For where a crumb fell upon the pool, there he saw the water broken, and at some times there was no splashing, but only a ridge that ran swiftly upon the face of the pool. Then, when all was finished, the hermit stood looking upon the water as one that loved the sound of it, and had no need to be elsewhere. But the sun was strong upon his head, and Ywain saw how he drew his hood around his neck where it was bare at the nape, and so went back to the house in the rock. And as he entered in at the doorway, the shadow was cool and dark upon him, and then he was gone as a fox goes into his earth. But Ywain mused yet a little while longer, and all that he had seen seemed strange and very good to him, like the tales of the elves and pixies, of whom there is nothing told that will not please young children, because they also have their dealing with the little things of the earth, and are of no account with grown men. And he wondered if this might be the end of his desire, to live secretly and far off from men, having his converse only with the creatures of the greenwood. Chapter 5. Of the hermit and of his dealing with Ywain. So within a while he got upon his feet and came to the door in the rock and called to the hermit. And the hermit came from within and stood shading his eyes with his hand, and asked him the reason of his calling. And Ywain answered him courteously, making as though to take his hat from off his head in sign of reverence. And the hermit lifted his eyes in the same moment, and saw that the hat was the hat of a pilgrim, and yet of no accustomed pilgrim, for there were upon it neither shells nor images. Also he saw that Ywain's cloak was not thread-worn, nor his shoes broken, and his face he could not well see for the brightness of the sunlight, but by his voice he might perceive him to be young and gentle, and none of the wandering rogues of whom all hermits dwell in dread. Then he brought him into his cave, that was as like a house as a cave may be, and he made him sit by a table, and gave him to eat and to drink. And when Ywain had well eaten and drunk, the hermit asked him concerning the way by which he had come, and the way by which he would go forth again. But he would not ask of his name, nor in what house he was born, nor even of his pilgrimage, for he also was courteous, and his mind was to pleasure his guest, and not himself only. Nevertheless he was not willing to lose the companionship that had fallen to him until he should have heard somewhat of the dealing of men, for it was long since he had had knowledge thereof by one of like breeding with himself. So he spoke to Ywain of tomorrow, and of certain things that he would show him, and Ywain heard him gladly enough, for his feet were now heavy with weariness and good eating. And the hermit knew this by the sound of his speech, and he laid him upon his own bed, and bade him take his ease. Now when Ywain awoke, he looked first upon the wall of the chamber, and saw that there was a glint of sunlight upon it high up, whereby he knew that the day was falling. Also he was aware that there was one watching him, and when he had turned his head, he saw how it was the hermit who stood in the doorway of the chamber, and the man's face seemed to him wise and quiet, as of one that had many thoughts and mastery therewith. So they two went to supper, and this was the first time that they had eaten together. And at one time they remembered this, and at another they forgot it. For they spoke not of their doing, but chiefly of their deeming. And often they would be eager the one to put question to the other, and often they would know before question put how the answer would be. Then at the last Ywain was minded to ask counsel of the hermit, and in one tale he told him all, to wit, how that in a day his life had changed, and how that he had left his own house and the house of his fathers, and gone out to seek his desire, and again how that he had as yet no certainty of what his desire might be. Only he told nothing of the boy that had come and led him away, but he put his own desire in place of the boy, for he was willing rather to be counted a fool than a teller of marvels. And he thought that his adventure might be judged as well by the part as by the whole, for that which he would hold back was in no wise the marrow of it. But the hermit said, Desire is a child, yet will he take a man by the hand and lead him away. Then Ywain was astonished, for he said within himself, How can this hermit have knowledge of the child, seeing that I told him nothing? Then the hermit said further, This is the part of a man, to know whether his desire be a wise child or a wayward. For the wayward will swiftly take him a wandering, and swiftly in his wandering will leave him, but the wise will never leave him utterly. Then Ywain asked him, By what reason may that be? And the hermit said, By nature, for every man is that which hath been and that which shall be. Then Ywain was yet more astonished, and his mind swung backwards, and he thought, Certainly I must have told him, for those words are every one of them the words of the boy. And instantly his mind swung again, and he thought, But I told him not. And he looked at the hermit's face and saw it hardly, for the twilight was covering it from him by little and little. But he saw the two eyes of him, and they were not fainter but clearer, and Ywain's heart lay open to them like water to the stars. And he said within himself, The words that I told not, he perceived them with his eyes. Then the hermit rose up softly and went out, and when he came again he brought heather and fern, and he made Ywain a bed beyond his own, and they slept before it was dark. Chapter 6. Yet more of the hermit, and of a word that was in Ywain's ears. In the morning when they had arisen, they went out of the house and came to the stream, for the hermit said that they should bathe in it, and he showed Ywain a pool that was deep enough. Then they did off their clothes hastily, and threw themselves into the water after the manner of otters, and at a stroke they came to the top of the pool. And there was a little waterfall there, and the stream of it carried them down, and they touched the stones and crept out upon them. Then they took the water again more strongly, and came right to the waterfall and stood beneath it, and it splashed upon their heads and divided the hair like a cold knife. And at that they laughed together, and so threw themselves back and were carried down again, and they came quickly to their clothes, blowing with their breath and shivering. But when they had run to the house they were warm and fresh. Then the hermit set 2 bowls of milk with bread upon the table, and Ywain was glad of the sight of that food, and he sat where the murmuring of the stream came in at the window, and a soft air with it, and the world was made new for him. But he ate and drank with few words, for he was thinking within himself how that to-morrow had come, and he knew not yet whether to go or stay. And often in his thinking he looked at the hermit, and the hermit looked kindly back at him and nodded, and it was as though he nodded to Ywain's thought, but he spoke nothing with his lips. Yet at one time there was a voice, and Ywain heard it plainly, and the voice said: "For delight men stay, but for desire they go forth." And he looked hard at the hermit, and the hermit nodded again to him, as though he also had heard that voice and knew it to say truth, but he spoke nothing with his lips. Then Ywain said aloud: "Surely I heard a voice, and it was not your voice nor mine, yet it seemed to me that I heard it not in my imagination but in my ears." And the hermit said: "I also heard it, and before this I have heard many such, and no great wonder, for in all solitude there will be voices, as in all still water there will be visions." And as Ywain heard those words he believed them, and he thought on still water, but found none in his remembrance. Only he saw before him the picture of the stream wherein he had but now been bathing, and the course of it was all racing and burbling, and where it lay more still, even there froth turned and drew together upon the face of it. And he asked the hermit boldly: "Where then is the still water of your visions?" And the hermit answered: "It is near at hand, but the looking is longer than the way thither." End of Part 2. Part 3 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 7 to 9. Chapter 7. How Ywain looked into the water of a well, and of that which he saw therein. Then they rose up and went out, and the hermit showed Ywain a little path that went along under the cliff, and so into the wood beyond. And thereby, he said, was the way to a dead thorn tree that stood in a space alone. And under the thorn tree was a well spring, and from the well spring came a runnel of bright water, whereby it might surely be found. Then he put a wheaten cake into Ywain's hand, and said to him: "Farewell now for to-day, and at supper time come again with your visions, and we will talk of them together. But when you stand by the well spring and look therein, then, said he, be not weary of your looking, but return always, and be always in hope until the sun go down. For the visions are not quickly to be seen, as the common sort suppose that they see all things which are before their faces, whereas they see, as it were, but the shadows upon the ground, and not the life of those who cast them. But that which you seek to see is the dealing of spirits, and men come not thereto suddenly, but by long time and loneliness." Then he returned from him, and Ywain took the path and went into the wood, and in no long space he saw a great thorn tree before him, and it was all dead and without leaf or berry, and other trees there were none very near it, but only the cliff that bore hard upon it on the one side, whereby it leaned a little outwards. And beneath the spread of it Ywain saw a well-head made of stone from the cliff, and it was of the height of a man's thigh. Also there was a step or margin of stone under it, and the step and the well-head were both shapen with 6 sides, every side equal to every other, after the manner of the waxen chambers of bees. And when Ywain came nearer, he saw that the spring rose in the well-head within 4 fingers of the brim, but it could not rise above the brim by reason of a little sluice below that was made in the stone above the step, and a runnel came therefrom of bright water and went into the wood darkling. Then he looked into the water of the spring, and it was deep and still, for the fountain was as great as the runnel and no more, so that there came no moving of the water that was above. But the shadow of the cliff lay yet upon the wellhead, for the sun was not high, and by that reason the face of the water was like the face of a mirror, and all that Ywain could see therein was his own image, and with that the image of the thorn tree, and no more could he see, though he looked long and warily. So for a while he ceased from looking, and he went into the wood beyond the well, and walked softly therein, for he meant to come again as the hermit had counselled him. And as he went he mused, and when he awoke out of his musing, he perceived that the sun was now high above him. Right so he turned about and came quickly back to the thorn tree, and looked again into the water, and where dimness had been there was sunlight, and the water was clear and thin, and in the depth of it were many lights, both shining and shimmering, for some of them rested in their glowing like embers, and some rose and curdled like smoke of gold, and so passed and came again continually. But of visions Ywain could find none, only these lights could he see, and else nothing. Then again he left looking in the water, and sat down under a green tree, for it was past noon and hotter than before. And he took his wheaten cake that the hermit had given him, and ate it sitting there. And as he ate, he thought on these days that were hardly yet 3 days since he left his former life, and they seemed to him to be as it were 3 long years that lay between him and the time that was before. Then suddenly he perceived that with his thinking the heat of the day had gone over, and the sun was dipped into the trees of the wood behind him where he sat. And he looked again towards the wellhead that stood there before him, and a light was upon the stone of it that was the last of the sunlight, and afterwards that light passed away and the stone was left dark. Then he knew that his time was come, and he leapt up and strode to the well and leaned over it. And at the first he looked and saw nothing, for a darkness seemed to rise and roll within it like a cloud in a storm. But after no long watching the darkness rolled away, and he saw clearly. Now that which he saw was a marvel, for it was not water, though it lay within the wellhead. Nor was it sunlight, for the sun was now far down behind the wood. But it was by seeming a piece of that country, as it were between the night and the day, for there was a wood and a river with a high bank, and in the sky above there was neither sun nor moon, but one only star of bright silver. And as he looked the star faded, by reason that the sky was more light, and he saw that the river was wide and shallow, and over the width of it were stepping stones, one beyond another in a line, like floats upon a fish net. And out of the wood came a boy, and though his face was turned away, yet could Ywain tell without doubt that he was in all things like the boy that had been with him. And his heart beat, and he strained in his watching, as one that fears lest he be seen or heard. But the boy came to the stepping stones and passed lightly over them, and began to go upon the bank. And as he went, there came a bright light upon the topmost of the bank, and Ywain perceived that it was the light of sunrise. And it fell upon a banner that was there, with men about it in armour, and twice or thrice there came sudden glints upon the armour, and for all that they seemed far off and small. It was clear to be seen that they fought together in 2 companies, and the boy, when he had climbed the bank, came to one of the companies and entered into it, and Ywain saw him no more. But that company stayed not where they were, for they were hard pushed in the fighting, and gave ground by inch and by inch. And one man of them, that had no helmet upon him, came to the edge of the bank with a horn in his right hand, and he set the horn to his mouth to blow it. And in that instant the darkness came again, and Ywain saw nothing but only the water in the well, and the cloud that rolled within the water. And he started up, and fear and joy took him in the same blood heat, and he turned and ran quickly by the path under the cliff. Chapter 8. How the hermit set Ywain on his way, and of two secrets that he told him. Now it was the hour when the hermit would be going to supper, and thereupon came Ywain to the house. And while they sat eating and drinking, Ywain told the hermit of that which he had seen, but he spoke warily, for he told him nothing of the boy. And the hermit said, The vision is yours and not mine. Yet this much concerning it is in my head, and not in yours. I tell you therefore, the woodside that was shown to you, and the stepping stones, and the bank beyond the water, all these are of no solitary vision, but may be seen of any man that has a mind thereto. Then said Ywain quickly, That mind have I. And the hermit looked him in the face, and nodded to him after his own fashion. Then he told him of the way to that place which he had seen, and as he spoke Ywain saw the way plainly, as it were before him, and the winding and the turns of it, and the stars above the trees, and the settling place of the moon. And the hermit said how it was a 9 hours' journey for a man like himself, that was now out of his youth and past hurrying. And when he heard that, Ywain kept silence for a moment. And in the silence he made his reckoning, that it wanted even now but 8 hours to sunrise. And thereupon he stood up suddenly upon his feet, and stretched out his hand to bid the hermit farewell. But the hermit left him there standing, and went to and fro, and took bread from the table, and put it in a wallet, and brought it to Ywain. And he took also a hunting knife from the wall behind the door, and a thong thereto, and gave it to him to belt about his middle. But Ywain laid it first upon the table, and drew the knife from out the sheath, and cut off a silver button of his cloak. And the knife he returned into the sheath and left it lying, and the button he gave to the hermit in token of bargain and sale, lest in the time to come by the gift of a knife their friendship should be parted, as hath happened unto many and many. And then he belted on the knife without fear, and they two went swiftly from the house, and came to the wood and entered into it. Now the moon was high and bright, being near the full, and the light of her came softly between the trees, and made clear the path. And Ywain and the hermit spoke little in their going, for all the need that they had of each other. But their speech seemed to them as it were forbidden, by reason of the shadows. So they went dumbly for the most part, walking the one before the other, and making great haste. And when a full hour was gone, they came to an open heath that was beyond the wood. And the hermit stayed there, and set him down upon the heather. And he said to Ywain that he could go with him no farther, for the moon was fast southing, and he was an hour's journey from home. But this he said courteously, as one that spoke of necessity, and against his own heart. Then Ywain sat by him, and suddenly in his heart also there came division, with thoughts straining this way and that, as two hounds that strain in the same leash. For though he was hot to follow his desire, yet he remembered the companionship of the hermit, and the quiet of his dwelling. Moreover he saw the man there beside him, and none to take his place. But again the remembrance of the boy drew him more strongly, and he chafed till he should be gone. So he said to the hermit, Let me go now, for even as they say of death, the longer the colder, so it is with the parting of friends. But I know also that I go too soon, for you have perceived of me more than ever I told you, and of a certainty with your counsel I might have feathered my shafts. And though this may not be, yet tell me now, I pray you, in few words, of the likelihood of this my journey, how it shall prosper, or in what danger it shall come, that I may thank you and fare the better. But the hermit said, In this you are astray, for that which a man may learn in solitude is not knowledge but wisdom, and wisdom is not of this or that, but of the nature of things. So now concerning you, I know not how you shall fare, but I know of that which you may become, and in some part I know the way thereto. Follow therefore your desire, for so only can you live and be alive, and this is the first secret. But the second is this, that you serve another, for so only can you put away your enemy that was born with you. And truth it is that if a man overtake his desire and have not done away with his enemy, it had been better for him that he had died first, for he shall never have peace. And Ywain heard the words and marked them, for they were spoken deeply. But what the meaning of them should be, that he knew not yet, for his mind was all abubble with the thoughts of his journey and of the boy, and of the fighting that he had seen in the vision. And the hermit perceived that he was distraught and in haste to be gone, and he stood up and bade him good speed. But first he took a promise of him that he would come again, and then he spoke the last words and turned away into the wood. And with that Ywain's heart fell, and his strength was slackened, and he laid his hand to the stem of a pine tree and leaned upon it, that he might keep watch upon the hermit until he should be wholly gone from him. And at the first he saw him as a living man, but afterwards as a shadow without form or substance, for that which he saw was ever moving through the forest and the moonlight, as a fish is seen dimly in green water going among the reeds. And at the last he saw him not at all, for the very shadow of him was wholly mingled with the night. Chapter 9. Of Ywain's journey by night, and how he was brought by a lady to the place of his vision, and so left her. So Ywain turned him from his watching, and as he turned him he drew his breath again, and his heart rose, and he took the path strongly among the heather. And he went therein a good 2 hours or more, until he saw upon his left side how the land rose up ridgewise like the back of a great hog. And for all that it was night, yet he saw the top of the ridge clearly, as it were a black line that ran along the sky. And thereover stood the moon all broad and yellow, and he perceived that this was the place of her setting, as the hermit had shown it to him by his counsel. Then he knew that it was hard on midnight, and he had great gladness because that he had come so far on his way and no time lost. And he left the heath and took a good road that was below the ridge, and for a little space the moon hung above him as if it were a great lantern of yellow horn. And then she sank behind the ridge, and in no time afterwards the land was dark. Nevertheless he ceased not to go swiftly and without stumbling, for the stars were now brighter before him, and the road under his feet was smooth and white with dust, so that he had no need to walk warily. And as he went he remembered all the words of the hermit, and he turned them over in his mind as a man turns over his money upon his hand. For it may chance that he knows not yet how much it is, or in what manner it may serve him. Even so Ywain considered the words of the hermit, and namely the 2 secrets, whereof one was plain to his understanding, and one was dark. For he was of himself fully minded to follow his desire, but to serve another was no such matter, seeing that in his old life he had served both lords and overlords, and for his wages had little but weariness. And in this wise he reasoned hotly as he went, speaking as it might have been to the hermit himself there present. Then upon the instant his sight went from him, as it happens many times to those that reason hotly, and he saw no more the road beneath him nor the stars above, but by seeming he came again into the house in the rock, and there was the hermit sitting over against him, and his eyes shining in the twilight. And Ywain said to the hermit, What is this secret that you have told me, and how can a man both follow his desire and also serve another? For by his desire he would be free, but service is to freedom as water upon fire. And the semblance of the hermit looked at him and nodded kindly, but he answered nothing to Ywain's questioning, save that he spoke again the former words. Then, because of the hermit's voice and the deepness of it and the quiet of his house, the tangle in Ywain's heart was untwisted, and he had no more lust of reasoning. And he came back as it were from another place, and perceived that he had been a long time absent. For the way was changed beneath his feet, and from being a high road was become a green ox drove, and the stars in the sky were few and pale. Then Ywain saw that the night was far gone, and fear came suddenly upon him lest in his dreaming he should have wandered aside from the right way. And he stood still to peer about him, but he could see nothing save only the ox drove and a little bank that was the border of it, and the field beyond the border. But while he stood still there came the sound of a cock crowing, and in the same instant he was aware of a tower that lay hard by, and it lay on the field all bare and open, where he had looked before and had seen nothing, until the crowing of the cock. But now he could see it without peering, and how it stood on a little mound in the field, with a pool beside it and a great rowan tree thereby. Then he made to go to the tower, and when he came to the bank to pass out of the ox drove, he found a gate therein. And he looked over the gate and saw how there was a door opened in the tower, and a woman that came out of it, and she began to go towards him over the field. So he passed through the gate and went out to meet her, and as he went he perceived that she was some great one, for she was richly arrayed in colours all of blue, and her raiment was close about her as the sheath is about a flower. Also she wore a veil and not a hood, and the veil was upon her head only and not upon her face, and it was light and cloudy like smoke in still air. And when they two drew together, the lady bade Ywain good morrow, and great wonder took hold upon him, for her voice came to him as it had been out of old memory. And whereas in her outward seeming there was nothing that was not strange to him, yet by her speaking he was persuaded heartily that he had known her all the years of his life. Then she asked him whither he went, and he began to tell her of the place of the stepping stones and of the fighting beyond the water. And she heard him courteously, but while he spoke she ceased not to go forward, so that in a short time they came again to the bank and the ox drove. And Ywain looked before him in the half light, and again he was amazed. For the gate was there by which he had passed out, and beside it were two horses, a white and a black, and by their bridle reins they were tethered to this post and to that. Then the lady came to the white horse, and she laid her hand upon the mane of him, and her one foot she gave into Ywain's hand, and so went to saddle and rode fast away. And Ywain took the black horse and followed hard after her. And they rode long, and the sky lightened towards dawn, and they went ever faster and faster, till the wind rushed by their faces as a stream rushes by the stakes of a weir. So they came to a wood and coasted it, for the trees of it were set so thick together that no horse might go therein. Also the land fell sheer and sudden within it, and in a 5 furlongs more the lady stayed her galloping, and she leapt down and cast away her bridle rein and turned her into the wood. And Ywain followed after her, and she caught him by the hand, and they two ran down the wood together with pain and stumbling. And they came to the edge of the wood, and the land there was level, and Ywain looked out between the trees and saw the place of his vision. For there before him was a meadow and a broad water with stepping stones, and beyond the water was a bank, and upon the top of the bank there went a banner, with men fighting about it. But child there was none to see, neither upon the stones, neither upon the bank. Then Ywain raged within himself to go forward, but first he turned him of his courtesy to give thanks to the lady, for he said that without help of her he had never come there, whereby he was wholly bounden to her, if that she would command him in anything. And she looked him in the eyes and said to him: Yea, sir, are you so bounden? Then have I found a friend to my need, for I have 100 knights that are sworn of my allegiance, yet there is none of them that serveth not his own desire before mine. Then despair came upon Ywain, as upon a wild thing that is trapped, and he struggled blindly and saw no way out. And in his struggling he heard the sound of a horn that was blown behind him, and he turned about and perceived him that blew it standing upon the height of the bank. And at the blare of that horn all the blood of his body was made fire, and he left the lady alone and went furiously up to go into the battle. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 10 to 12. Chapter 10. Of the Lady Enya, and of the gifts that she had from her birth. Now we leave Ywain to his fighting, and turn we to the lady that was there heavily cast down to be so left and be nothinged. For she was of all earthly women the most beautiful and the wisest in magic. Yet she had great need of such as would serve her truly, for her life was full of pain and perplexity, being divided in a strange manner between two realms. And this came of no sudden hap, for it fortuned so to her from her birth, and was according unto her nature, as I shall show you. First then, she was of a high lineage, and descended out of Faery. For her father was Sir Olga, Lord of Kerioc, that lies over beside Broceliande. And her mother was called the Lady Ailinn of Ireland, and she came of the kindred of Phelim of the Sidhe, that was called Phelim of the Nine Shapes, by reason that she could take on her 9 shapes, and each more beautiful than other. Therefore the Lady Ailinn would have called her daughter Phelima, but Sir Olga named her with the name of Enya, and she was called thereby all her life days, as for her earthly name. But of her elfin nature she had other names, as was but reason, and in especial one name she had that none ever knew but Ywain only. So of that name I shall make no more matter. Now when the Lady Ailinn had been some while wedded, and was looking for her child to be born presently, upon a night she lay abed in the castle of Kerioc. And midnight was 2 hours past, and there was none waking but that lady alone. And in her chamber was a fire of wood burning, for the year was still cold and hard, and the fire was bright, and cast upon the wall of the chamber both light and shadow. And Ailinn lay so upon her bed that she saw not the window, but the wall only, and she perceived that the shadow upon it was the shadow of her nurse, that was fallen asleep beside the hearthstone. Nevertheless, though the nurse slept, yet were there voices in the chamber as of 2 women beside the fire, and Ailinn knew well that they were fays or women of the Sidhe, seeing that there were upon the wall no shadows of them, but only of the nurse. So she lay still to hearken what they would say, and one said: "The child shall be a woman, and I give her the gifts of womanhood, for her skin shall be white as the swans of Angus, and her eyes grey like the dawn, and the colour of her cheeks soft like the sunset. And she shall be loved by 100 knights and one, and her love shall be to her true lover both meat and madness, like the wild honey of Arroy. And so is my giving done." And the other said: "The child shall be a fay, and I shall give her the gifts of faery, for she shall hold of me the realm of Aladore, that was the Rhymer's heritage. And of her own magic she shall come thereto and therefrom all her days. And so is my giving done." Then the 2 voices fell silent, and Ailinn turned upon her bed that she might see after what likeness they were that had spoken, and she saw no one by the fire save the nurse only. But in that moment came the moon going downwards to the sea, and a beam of her shining entered into the chamber and lay upon the floor, and so moved across the floor and came to the hearthstone. And in that beam Ailinn saw plainly how there stood 2 shapes of women between the bedside and the hearth. And they were grey shapes and thin as air, for she saw behind them the fire burning and the embers of it, but she saw it some deal faint, as it were behind 2 wisps of smoke. Then those 2 fays drew near to her and stood by the bedside, and the one of them touched her head, and the other touched her hand, and at the touch of them her blood was made heavy, and she slept deep beyond voice or vision. And in the morning when she awoke she found in her hand a golden key, and upon her head she found also a golden comb that she knew not. And by the tokens of the key and the comb she had certainty of that which she had heard and seen. But of the meaning thereof she held great debate with herself, and might not be satisfied. And she thought to take counsel of her kindred when she should come again into Ireland. But to Sir Ogier, that was her husband, she said nothing of the matter, for he was a man that had no dreams, neither by night neither by day. Then in a short space thereafter the child was born that was called Aithne, and she was heir to her father and her mother both. For other child they had none, man nor maid, but this one only. And she was a wise child and a beautiful, but always she made for herself a way and walked in it. And when she was come to 7 year, and it was the day of her birth, she played in the castle of Kerioc all such games as she would. And at the last she came into her mother's chamber, and there found a little chest and opened it. And in the chest was a comb of gold and a key of the same, and the key she left there lying. But the comb she laid into her hair, and stood before a mirror and preened herself. Then came her mother suddenly, and took the comb from her, and gave her instead the key of gold to make her a game therewith. And right so the child was gone from the place, and she was seen no more in Kerioc for the space of 3 hours. Then before night she came again with the like swiftness, and she was no whit weary or hungry or afeared, but she greeted her mother dearly, as one that had been long gone from her into a far country. And afterwards the child said how that she had been in Aladore, and the time that she had been there was by her deeming 3 years, for she said firmly that she had seen the cowslips there 3 several times, and 3 times had gathered them all fresh in their springing. And thereat her father laughed out, as a man will laugh that hath the better knowledge. But the Lady Ailinn perceived that she spoke truth, and as the child had said, so it was with her many times thereafter, for she came and went by her own magic, and that was by the gift that she had of Fairy. Chapter 11. How the Lady Ailinn departed out of this life, and of the counsel that she gave to her daughter Aithne. Then with the years so passing, the time came that Aithne was a damsel grown, and many knights sought her love, and many asked to have her in marriage. And it happened at this time that her mother, the Lady Ailinn, was taken with sickness, and though her malady was but light to the deeming of such as saw her and heard her speak thereof, yet inwardly she knew that the end of it was to be by death only. So upon a day she lay in her chamber in the castle of Kerioc, and Aithne sat there beside her, and they talked together of this and of that. And at the last the Lady Ailinn ceased from talking, and then she spoke to Aithne again and said: My daughter, I would not have you parted from me by blindness, as others are parted from me. For they deem that in the spring I shall be healed of this my malady, whereas I know inwardly that before the thorn is hoar I must be otherwhere. And of that, beloved, I say no more, for you too shall one day pass out by this gate, and I bid you to the tryst after death. But as for your earthly life, I have a counsel for you, that you consider well to whom you give yourself, seeing that a woman should not love but after her own kind, and for one such as you are, this may well be a hard thing to compass. For the half of your heart is with the Fairy, and the half of your days you live in a land that is no land of men. And of that land I also have had knowledge, for I was some while there in my maidenhood, and though I came never there again, yet have I remembered it in my dreams, and I know this, that few men find the way thereto. Yet will a maiden think, as I also thought, to take a man for lord and lover, and to bring him in thither, but the magic of it is not so, for every man must win there by his own desire.
Choose then whom you will as your sovereignty. But if it may be, my daughter, before your choice be uttered, come you up hither into this that was my chamber, wherein also you were born, and remember me, and how that I spoke with you of that realm that is your heritage. So shall your choice be my choice, for good fortune or for ill, and we two shall not be parted." Then Enya, when she heard those words, held her mother fast by the hand, and bowed her head down upon the pillow beside her, and she wept bitterly, for the heart of youth cannot bear to hear speak of death and departing. And it is no marvel, seeing that the darkness is great, and the tryst is very far off. So it was with Enya at her mother's departing, for in no long time afterwards that lady's life failed her, as in this world, and she was gone. But Sir Ogier, for all his grief, was still the more minded to make for his daughter some marriage of good counsel, for he held women to be as it were ships, that may fetch and carry well enough, but without a master they are blown about and go no whither. Now came again those knights of whom I spoke before, and they were by number 100 from the first to the last, and they loved her all of them, not for her lands only, but each with such love as he had, for her beauty some, and some for her sweet voice, for oftentimes when she spoke and looked, the blood would dance in them that heard her. And many there were that came from far countries, whereof some sought her for the praise that went abroad of her, even to the out isles, and some for the renown of her father Sir Ogier, for he was a great knight under shield, and a hunter that never knew weariness. And thereby he came quickly to his end, for he took the river with a horse that was wholly spent. So Enya was left alone, and her loneliness was great, for always in her castle of Kerioc she saw the faces of them that were otherwhere, and at night she had no peace for the crying of the sea-birds. And many times she made escape into her realm of Aladore, but there also was loneliness, for she had found as yet no soul to dwell with her. I speak not of fays, for of them there was great plenty, but they have no comfort in them, for they are born of moonlight and not of blood and breath. Therefore also they are from the beginning without transgression, and they know not pain or memory, neither do they fear or hope at all. And of these Enya took no count, save that she dwelt often with them and was their lady in Aladore. But of the knights that were her earthly servants she took much pleasure and perplexity, and to one or another of them she came near to have yielded her. Yet when the time came, at every time she held aback, for she remembered her mother the Lady Ailinn, and the promise that she made to her at her departing, and always when she thought of her words she saw that they were true. And therewith she remembered a saying of her father, and she saw that this also was true, as for the most part. For he had said of men and women that though they be born of one blood, yet they are ever strangers each to other, both by kind and by custom, and though they sit at one board and lie under one blanket, yet they dwell apart all their life days. But Enya hated that saying in her heart, and in her hope she bettered it. Chapter 12. Of the warring of two companies, and how Ywain did battle for the one of them against the other. Mark now that which I tell you concerning the Lady Enya, for after the manner of minstrels I tell you both that which she knew herself and that which she knew not. First then she knew not, for all her magic, that this was a man of a strange fortune, and as it were born again by the casting away of his possessions. Nor she knew not yet what her spirit and his spirit had perceived at first sight, each of other. But she knew in her heart darkly that he was either boon or bane to her, for of his coming she had been warned without words, as it will happen to those that have the gift. And this also darkly, that his looking and his speaking were both to her mind, whereby she was the more cast down at his breaking from her. And again she knew not wherefore he should wish to go. Yet she could not choose but remember that he seemed to have some great purpose in his going, and upon a man's face such purpose will show like beauty, so that even out of her pain there grew a sweetness, as fruit grows out of the wounding of a tree. But Ywain thought not at all of her, neither darkly nor clearly, for he saw the banner upon the top of the bank, and under it the two companies fighting. And they fought in a green ground before the gate of a city. And they that fought to keep the city were all of a likeness, armed every one in black armour, and their banner was of black with a golden tower upon it. But they that strove against them were furnished scantily and piecemeal, no two alike, save that every man of them had a sword in his hand, and upon his body a badge of silver scutcheon with an eagle displayed therein. And though the badges were of one fashion, yet they were of diverse colours. Now when Ywain came to the top of the bank, he saw the companies and the city some deal beyond them, and he looked about him to see the boy, and saw nothing of him. But hard by there was a man there standing, the same that had blown upon the horn, and beside his feet upon the grass lay two naked swords. And as Ywain looked towards him, he threw down his horn and took up the two swords, and the one of them he gave into Ywain's hand, and the other he took by the hilt. And without a word said, they two began running towards the banner, for it was some way from the bank thereto. And when they were come there where the banner was, Ywain saw that the companies had ceased from fighting, and were standing apart. And they were glad to do so, as he guessed, by reason that the men of the tower were weary and fordone with the burden of their armour. And as for the men of the Eagle, they were beaten back, and there were many of them wounded and some dead men. But the battle in this manner standing still, there came forth a man of the tower, armed at all points, and he mocked the men of the Eagle for striplings and fools, and defied them to fight with him man to man, and one down another to come on. Then when Ywain heard those proud words, it seemed to him as though the quarrel were his own quarrel, and the scorn of his proper enemy. For he looked upon the company of the Eagle and saw them as men, enduring with weariness and pain. But those of the tower he saw not as human flesh, but as ironwork of artificers, multiplied according to one pattern, and without blood or mercy in them. And he hated them, and the green earth went red before his eyes. Then again his blood changed, and his heart became hard and smooth, and cool like the heart of oak. And he stooped slowly, and took from a dead man the badge that he had worn, and made it fast upon him. And he threw down his cloak, and in his left hand he took the knife that the hermit had given him, and in his right hand the sword. And he stepped forward until he came within 5 paces of his enemy. And the two companies drew near to watch the fighting, and the man of the tower let close his visor and came on. And Ywain looked at him and saw how he moved him as one that bears a great weight, and underprops it warily lest it fall over on this side or on that. And he remembered to have moved himself in like manner at the end of day, when he was outwearied in the wars. And he laughed in his heart at the remembrance, for it seemed to him of good counsel. And in that moment he saw his enemy make at him to strike, and he caught the stroke upon his sword and put it by, and ran in upon him as dog runs in upon dog, and caught him by the throat, and shook him one way with his arms and another with his knee, and threw him down upon the ground. Then the man of the tower rolled heavily in his armour, that he might come to his knees and rise again. But in his rolling Ywain fell upon him and pressed him down, so that he grubbled in the earth with his visor as a swine grubbles with his snout. And Ywain held him so, and leaned upon him, and he struggled with his legs a little, but no long time, for his breath left him. Then Ywain found the lace of his helm, and with the hermit's knife he cut it to recover him. And in the cutting of it he was aware of a great shouting and ramping all about him.
And he looked up and saw that the men of the Eagle had run in upon those of the tower, even as he had run in upon his man, and had toppled them in like manner, and they were prising them open with their swords, whereby in short space they had them all unharnessed and disarmed. Then Ywain got him to his feet, and the rest in likewise, and they of the Eagle gave the banner into Ywain's hands and set him in the forefront, and they marshalled the men of the tower as beaten men behind him, and so set forth with shouting towards the city. End of Part 4. Part 5 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 13 to 15. Chapter 13. How Ywain was brought into the city of Paladore. Well may you imagine that Ywain was astonished as he went, for it came upon him coldly that he knew not what he had done, nor wherefore, and moreover he saw that he had not yet come to the end of the matter, and he would willingly have questioned those who went with him, but they were every man of them a bawling and a singing, and when he spoke to them they answered nothing to the purpose, but continued praising him and giving him joy. And so with great tumult they came before the gate of the city, and there was Ywain yet more astonished, for he had thought to find it well shut and defended, but now the barriers were down and the gate was open, and upon the gatehouse and upon the walls there stood a multitude of people past counting, and they cried, "An eagle, an eagle!" and shouted for joy every man louder than another. Then Ywain and they that were with him entered the gateway and passed through it, and began to go into the city. And certain of the townsfolk took the banner from between Ywain's hands and carried it before him, and others of them pressed upon the beaten men of the tower and jeered at them by their names and cast dust upon their heads. And so they came all together to the market-place, which was great and square, but the crowd of them filled it from side to side and from end to end, and stood therein as close as standing barley. Now on one side of the market-place was a high hall with steps thereto, and those that led Ywain brought him to the steps and made him stand there upon a width of stone where he could be seen of all, and the multitude threw up their hands and waved them at him, crying that he should speak to them. And this he would have done willingly, as one not unused to speak before others. But what he should find to say to these men, that he could no more tell than a babe unborn, for he was alone in a strange world, and the time of his understanding was not yet begun. Moreover, though the secret of Solomon had been in his mouth, yet he could not have uttered it for the noise of the shouting which came about him like the clamouring of rooks when they are fluttered, and so continued for the space of a good hour. And an evil hour it was for him, seeing that the sun was now high and fierce, and the burden of it made his back weary, and the noise became as it were a bruise within his head. And at the last, when it was now hard on noon, he saw that the crowd was moved and parted to right and left, and through the midst there came a train of great ones, walking slowly between halberdiers and trumpeters. And they came upon the steps of the great hall where Ywain was standing, and saluted him with bowing. And two that were servants brought him a robe of black, broidered with gold, and they made as though they would have taken from him his cloak of pilgrimage. But that he would by no means suffer, for he remembered how he had come by it, so that in the end they covered his cloak with the robe and were content. Then two of the chief ones took him by the hand and led him into the great hall, and there went in after them all that train and many more. Chapter 14. How Ywain sat at feast in Paladore with the company of the Tower and the company of the Eagle. Now the hall was ordered within as for a feast, and the ordering of it was after the accustomed manner of feasts, for at one end of it was a high table upon a dais,
and other 2 tables there were that came squarely therefrom, as the 2 posts of a door come squarely from the lintel. And the napery upon the tables was fine and white, and the dishes were of silver. But upon the dais was a cupboard, and the cups upon it, and the ewers and the plates were all of gold. And up and down the hall there went 6 marshals, who showed courteously to each man where he should be seated. And they showed to Ywain a seat at the high table, and when he sat therein he overlooked well nigh all the hall. Then came 2 pages with water to let wash his hands, whereof he thanked them without feigning. Then the marshals brought to him those that should sit on either side of him, and when they had demanded of Ywain how he should be called, then they named each to other by their names. And of those 2 the one was called Sir Rainald, and he was shaped like a pear, and yellowed in face, and slow of speech as one upon whom men wait. And about his neck was a gold chain, and a jewel of gold hung thereby, made in the fashion of a tower. But the other of them was by name Hubert, and he was a young man and slight, and he bore upon him the scutcheon of the eagle, and his speech was restless and full of joy. Then stood up a great archbishop, and a herald smote upon the table and called loudly for silence. And when the archbishop had spoken a set piece of grace, then all men stirred and sat them down again with much clatter. And thereupon came servitors and served every man with meat and drink. And as Ywain ate and drank, his weariness departed, and his spirit came again to him, and he was minded to learn the truth of all that he had seen that day, to which end he turned him first to Sir Rainald, seeing that he was manifestly of the Tower, and dwelt, as Ywain supposed, within the city. But Sir Rainald was not to be so handled, for he was such an one as would liefer ask 10 questions than answer 2, and his manner of speaking was like water that is slow and deep, against which there is no force to stand, but only to go therewith. Yet was the man courteous after his kind, for he said how that Ywain had done well, as for so young a fighter, and might yet come to some good. And though he knew it not, yet in one matter he told Ywain that which he would have asked him, for when he began to speak he demanded to know this, whether Ywain had been in Aladore at any time past, or was only that day come among them. And thereby Ywain perceived that the name of the city was called Aladore. Then in no long time weariness came upon Ywain, and he left speaking with Sir Rainald, making excuse in the best manner that he could, and he set his hope upon the young man Hubert, for he saw that he bore the scutcheon of the eagle. And Hubert told him all that he asked, and more thereto, for he said that what was done according to the custom of the city, whereby each year they banished all such of the young men as had come to their strength, and once in each year the young men came before the gate in company and demanded to enter. And they were favoured of many within the city, but certain of the elders went out and fought with them to drive them away. And this they did because of the company of the Tower, for it was a most ancient company, and they feared greatly lest the young men should change the ordinance thereof, seeing that it was fitter for men in age than in youth. Then Ywain asked him concerning the company of the Eagle, and first what was the ordinance of it. And Hubert said that they had no ordinance but one, and that was that every man should wear his own colours and do after his own heart, and this also, that he should always and in all places fight against the Tower. Then Ywain asked him again whether it was so that the Eagles had always the better of the Tower as they had at this present. And Hubert said that there was no such fortune, for though they were many in number and of a great spirit, yet they were poor and poorly furnished. And there was yet another reason, and that was because they kept no fellowship together and had small knowledge of war. For as soon as one of them gathered skill or strength in fighting, they of the Tower came secretly and offered him entrance, so that for the time to come he fought not against them. Yet time and again, he said, there would come one that could not be reckoned with, so that once in 10 years, as it might be, the Eagles would have the mastery.
and for the hope of such an one the horn was blown to call him to the place of the fighting. Then Ywain left that, lest he should seem to speak of himself, and he said how he was astonished because that he saw about him both those of the Eagle and those of the Tower sitting and feasting together after so cruel a day's work. And Hubert answered that this also was of the custom, and great was the evil that came of it. For though a young man, he said, may become old before his time, never will an old man come back into the mind of his youth. So that it was but according with nature that through the mingling of the companies the Tower should be continually plenished and the Eagles minished. Then the herald called again for silence, and Ywain and Hubert spoke no more together. And when the Archbishop had chanted yet another piece, then all men went out from the hall. Chapter 15. Of the gifts that were given to Ywain, and of a dream that he dreamed. And it was now long past noon, but the crowd continued still in the market-place, and when they saw Ywain come out upon the steps they shouted again, for above all things they loved to see fighting, and to hear tell of it. Also they were glad when they saw the Eagle go before the Tower, for men will reverence their betters, and yet take pleasure to see them discomfited. Moreover, they of the Tower ruled continually over them, and were thereby the heavier to bear, but they of the Eagle came only to make sport for them. Ywain therefore perceived that the commons held him in honour of their own good will, but the great ones he deemed to be his friends in fear rather than in love, honouring him for the sake of the custom and because he had the good will of others. Nevertheless they spoke not so, but continued in their courtesy, for they set him in the midmost of their train and brought him through the city to a house that was made ready for him, and the house and all that was in it they gave him freely to have and to hold. Furthermore, they gave him certain customary gifts in such case provided, and first a hogshead of wine very sweet and very drowsy, and this was the gift of the Eagles, and second, a silver collar that all men might salute him whensoever they saw it, and this was the gift of them of the Tower, for they themselves loved such greeting beyond measure. And the third gift was a full bushel of gold, and this was the gift of the whole city, and the greatest of the three, for in Aladore they have a saying that gold is the noblest of the metals, and nobleness they honour above all virtues. Then when they had given Ywain these gifts, they took their leave of him, as for that time, and Ywain thanked them as best he might, and made fast the door of his house. And for a short space he was content to look about him at one thing and another, as a child will play with his toys when they are new. And then he thought to taste of the wine that had been given him, and when he had drawn a little of it into a cup he drank it, and for a moment he had some joy thereof, for it was sweet upon the tongue and ran bravely through his blood. But afterwards the drowsiness in it was yet stronger than the sweetness and the bravery, so that he desired no more to live, but only to dream, and instantly he had his desire. Now in his dream it seemed to him that he awoke out of sleep, and saw that the sun was set and the moon rising. And in the moonlight he saw beside him a boy weeping, and it was the boy whom he had followed and found not. Then Ywain had great pain at the heart, and he asked him the reason of his weeping. And the boy gave him no word, either of reason or unreason, but continued weeping pitifully. So for comfort Ywain took him by the hand, and instantly the boy left weeping and made to go forth. And he led Ywain from the house as formerly he had left him from the house of Sulney. Then they two went through the streets together, and came quickly to the gate of the city, that was the same by which Ywain had come in. And the gate was shut and locked, and the porter gone within the gatehouse. But the boy laid his hand against the wicket and opened it lightly, and he drew Ywain after him, and they went out towards the place of the fighting. And the boy stayed not there, but went forward to the edge of the steep bank and looked towards the wood. And Ywain also looked with him,
and he saw the river and the stepping stones and the meadow ground beyond them. And by the woodside was a poplar tree new fallen, and thereon he saw under the moon that lady sitting. And suddenly in his dream he repented him that he had so left her, and he well knew wherefore the boy had wept. And they two ran down to her together, and Ywain cast himself before her, and he laid his hands between her hands, and sware by his faith to serve her truly. And in his dream she looked kindly upon him, and he saw her eyes, and they were grey like the dawn, and filled with coming brightness. So he turned him about to bring in the boy, that he also might be comforted. But the place was all clear moonlight, and the boy there was none, neither to right nor to left. Then the lady rose up and went towards the city of Paladore, and Ywain went with her, and she brought him to the gate, and it was shut. But with her hand she touched the wicket, and so opened it, and they entered in thereat. And in short space they came to Ywain's house, and passed it by. And when they had gone some deal farther, they came before a house that Ywain knew not, where was a great shield of arms beside the doorway. And there the lady stayed, and she looked at Ywain, and he at her. And when he thought that she would have said somewhat, she turned her away. And she went from him into the house without word spoken. Then Ywain also went his way, and as he went in his dream, the moon set and the sun rose on Paladore. End of Part 5. Part 6 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 16 to 18. Chapter 16. How Ywain found his lady again, and how she went from him the second time. Long time was Ywain musing on that which had befallen him by night, and it seemed to him that he had been made to live as it were in two lives, seeing that out of one sleep he had twice awakened. And of the truth of this he had no certainty, but of his service that he had sworn to his lady, of that he had certainty. For whether in his dream or out of his dream, his heart assented thereto. Moreover he desired greatly to come again to that house where he had seen her go from him, and if such a house there were in Paladore, he doubted not to find it, for he saw yet before his eyes the shield of arms that was there beside the door, and it was party of sable and silver, with a ship sailing therein counter-coloured. But now while he was musing came a messenger from Sir Rainald, and entreated him of his courtesy that he would be with Sir Rainald shortly, for he had that to say to Ywain which was worth his hearing. So Ywain went with the messenger and came to Sir Rainald. Then Sir Rainald spoke to him slowly and with many words, as men speak of grave matters. And he told Ywain how he was commanded to bring him that same day before the Prince of Paladore, and he gave him joy therewith, for he said that the honour was great, and such as fell not commonly to them that were strangers, but if they were on some embassage. Then Ywain thanked him in such words as were fitting, and so covered his thought, for in his old life he had had knowledge of princes, and he was well away weary even to remember them. Yet for the desire that he had to meet again with his lady and to do her service, he was willing to pleasure Sir Rainald and the Prince and any other. So when an hour had been set that he should meet with Sir Rainald before the door of the Great Guard, then Ywain took his leave and was gone until the evening. At first he came hastily to his own house, for before any other thing that he might do, he was set to find that house of the shield, and he thought to go by the way of his dream. And he found the way like as he remembered it, and came before the house and saw the shield. And he entered into the house, for the door was unlatched, and there was no man to stay him or to answer him. Yet he entered not so easily, for the door stood heavy against his hand, and cried out upon him, and he perceived that the hinges of it were eaten with old rust. Also upon the inward side of it was much cobweb of spiders, and in the hallway dust like grey sand upon the flags. Then he went from chamber to chamber, and they were all wide and waste in like manner. And his eyes were darkened to look upon the place, and his heart was cold within him, for he saw it as a place of the dead that was mouldering and forgotten. Then at last he came into a little chamber that was high above the hall, and it was the chamber of all the house that was most richly hung and furnished, and in it was a lute and a book, and a frame of broidery, and upon the wall a round mirror of glass. And he came to the mirror and stood still to look into it, and when he looked, the blood leapt in his heart as a horse leaps to the spur. For in the glass was the chamber made small and clear, as it were far off, and all things in order as he had seen them, save only that before the frame of broidery he saw a lady sitting at the work. And for all the bending of her head and the shadow upon her, he knew well that she was his own lady, and he kept watch upon her where he stood. For to move him from the mirror he dare not, lest she should go from him again. Then he saw in the glass how she raised her head and looked, and in that same instant the mirror was filled with cloud, and he turned him swiftly about in great fear. But his fear was vain, for his lady was verily there before him sitting, and by her the book and the lute, and all things in the chamber. And she gave him no greeting, but bent still to her broidery, and made as though he had been long time there with her. And presently she bade him take the lute and sing thereto, and her voice was light and careless, as of one that thought most of her own business. Then he was ashamed, for he had no skill with the lute, and he prayed her forgiveness humbly. Then she said it was no matter, but that he should take the book and read to her. And he took the book and opened it, but every word that was in it was written in an unknown tongue, so that he was ashamed for this time also. Then again she said it was no matter, but for a little while she was silent, and afterward she bade him look from the window and tell her of that which he saw. So he came to the window, that was an oriel and high above the ground, and before it and beneath lay the ridge tiles of the city, and beyond them was a wall with battlements, and above the battlements was a long line and dim, where the sky met with the sea. Then he said to his lady, I see some part of the city hereunder, and what shall I say of it to do you pleasure? But she answered him that he should look not upon the city but beyond it. Then he said to her, I see above the battlements a dimness of blue, and in it is a line where the sky meets with the sea, and what more shall I say of it to do you pleasure? And she answered him not, but left her broidering, and so came and stood beside him at the window. And they two looked upon the sea together, and at the last she said to him, Look well now and tell me all, for I see that of which you have not told me. And he looked again, shading his eyes with his hand and peering carefully, but nothing could he see save one dimness upon another. Then an evil thought came into his mind, and he said within himself, This is her will, to put shame upon me, and to make me speak of that which I see not, as though I saw it with my eyes. Then he looked once again, and as he looked he spoke, and in his voice was a little grain of anger, as small as the sand that grits between the teeth. And he said, I see nothing where nothing is. And in that instant he heard his lady sigh, there as she stood beside him, and sorrow came upon him to hear her, and he would have turned to yield himself. And he turned and found her not, for in the taking of a breath she was gone from him. Chapter 17. Of Aladore, and of the sands called the Shepherdine Sands. Then Ywain groaned inwardly, for he said, I am a fool, and worse than a fool. And for a moment he hated himself and all that he had done. But afterward he considered a little and said, This comes not of folly but of newness, for I have not been used to live in two several lives.
Yet by all seeming my lady does even so, and I with her. Therefore she knew well that I was her sworn servant, dream in and dream out, and if I had bethought me of this I had never been angry. But now I have offended the second time, and how I am to meet with her again I cannot tell, seeing that she comes and goes like the wind among the leaves. So he went down to the house and out of it, and set his face to go toward the sea, for he thought by carefulness or by good hap he might come to perceive that which before had been hid from him. And as he went he heard one call him by his name, and he looked about and saw the young man Hubert behind him coming quickly. And he stayed for him, so that they went forward together, and as they went they talked. And this time also Hubert told Ywain all such things as he demanded to know, for whether feasting or fasting, he was ever the same man, and his speech was restless and joyful. And at first Ywain asked him of the house of the shield, wherefrom he had come, and Hubert said it was of old the house of Sir Ogier, but now of his daughter, the Lady Aithne, for Sir Ogier was by his own outrageousness drowned and dead. And of the Lady Aithne he said that she was beautiful beyond telling, and therein Ywain well believed him. And then he said that she came never there, but hated them of Paladore, and forsook them utterly. And Ywain laid that saying by, that he might ponder it. Then in their talking they came to the wall of the city, and Ywain saw before him a gate that he knew not yet, and beside it upon the left hand was a castle and a courtyard, and men afoot with halberds, and men ahorse with swords drawn, and many folk coming and going. And this, said Hubert, is the great guard of the Prince of Paladore, and it lies against the wall of the city and overtops it, and so runs a good furlong to the south. But on the east it stands above the city, and looks down into it, as a tree may stand above a sheepfold. Yet not so in truth, for in what place a tree stands, there will it look down on this side and on that, and not on one side only, as it is with this guard of theirs. Therewith he brought Ywain to the gate, and so out of the city, and he turned about and showed him that on this side the face of the great guard was as it were blind, and in no way looked upon the sea. And Ywain was astonished thereat, for the place was passing beautiful, with a broad way beneath the wall, and a border of great trees, and between the trees the wide water, coloured diversely with green and purple colours. Then he looked out as far as eye might see, and as he looked he forgot Hubert and remembered Aithne, for he longed greatly to know what was the thing which she had perceived and he not. Then he turned back in his thought to Hubert and asked of him, What place is this, and for what reason so forsaken? And Hubert answered, Well it is that you ask this of me and of none other, for the place is called the High Steep of Paladore, and it is not forsaken but forbidden. For in Paladore the sea is held for a dread thing and an evil, and the great ones, and those of the tower and those of the prince's household, will have it neither in sight nor in hearing, so that it is not so much as named with us, save now and then with women, or else with harpers and rhymers and the like. Then Ywain said, Without doubt you make mirth of me, for I perceive that you are speaking one thing and thinking of another, as men use in jesting. But Hubert said, There is no mirth in the matter, save it be the mirth that covers aching bones. For at times we have sight from hence of that which in all the world we most desire, and well begone is he that sees it. Yet for this desire are we shamed and slighted, as children are hushed that speak foolishly among their elders. But what see you, said Ywain, or what desire you to see? And therewith his heart began to go to and fro, for he knew that he was near his lady's secret. Then Hubert laughed a little, and made as though he would answer him, but he answered him as it were slantwise. For he said, Their shame is a toothless dog. And again he said, They see but little that never see Aladore. Then of a sudden he changed his manner of speaking, and went laughing and talking at great random, whereby Ywain perceived that he had done with that matter, and would have no more of it,
until he should return into his former mind. So Ywain took counsel with himself to lay wait for him there, seeing that it behoved him greatly for his lady's sake to hear tell of Aladore. Then they two left the way under the wall, and passed out between the trees, and they cast themselves down upon the grass, and lay there for a space, looking towards the sea. And below them where they lay was the high steep, grey and green, and below the steep was a beach upon the margents of the water. And as for the water, that was of two kinds, for nigh land it was unvexed and still, as a deep river is still, but a mile out it was broken and foam-flocked, as it were a great green meadow, and 1,000 of white sheep thereon, and so continued as far out as eye could see. And Ywain marvelled to see the breaking of the water, for there was no wind, and the tide was well nigh silent upon the strand. And Hubert told him that it was no marvel, for the water inshore was deep, so that a ship might go thereon. But out yonder, he said, no man may sail and keep his life, for the sea is full on every side with banks of sand, and the name of them is called the Shepherdine Sands, and many a one have they covered from all sight and seeking.
Then said Ywain, They are well named by the name of the Shepherdine Sands, for I see the sheep plainly. But tell me this, for what sake any man should go among them to peril of death? And Hubert said, For the sake of Aladore. Then Ywain thought to anger him that he might be the more certainly answered. So he spoke scornfully and said, What manner of men are they that for such a sake will go to peril of death? But Hubert was no whit angered, and he said joyfully, Well worth the peril and the death, for they tell such tales of Aladore that if but the half of them be true, then may it well be the land of every man's desire. And this you believe not yet, for you have not seen it, nor can I tell you on what day or by what enchantment you may come to see it. For a man may watch half his life in vain, and suddenly in the lifting of his eyes it will be there, between sea and sky, as clear as stone in sunlight. Then when he heard this, Ywain was silent for a space, and continued looking out to seaward, but he saw there nothing that was new, for he saw only the still water anear him, and afar off the blue border of the sky, and between them he saw that pasture perilous of the Shepherdine Sands. Chapter 18. Of Paladore and of the princes thereof. Right so came the sound of trumpets from within the battlements, and Hubert started up upon his feet, and said joyfully how it was the trumpets in the great guard blowing to hall. And he made Ywain also to rise up and go with him, and he brought him again through the gate and into the city, and so to his own lodging. And there Hubert would have Ywain to dine with him and with certain others. And of those others one was named Maurice, and another Bartholomew, and the third Dennis. And they were all three of them young men and restless in their speech, as was Hubert himself. So they five talked together all the time of dinner, and afterward they rose not from the table, but continued talking. And as reason was, so it happened in their talk, that there was ever one that made question and four that answered, whereby at the last it seemed to Ywain that his head span round, for they four smote him with strange sayings on this side and on that, as boys will smite a top and spin it. And when they had told him the customs of Paladore concerning war and witchcraft and marriage, then they told him of the clergy and the court. And of clergy they said that there was scarce one to be seen in all the city, for the great ones believed them not, and the commons loved them not. Therefore they banished them for the most part, yet not far off, lest evil should come thereby, or some sudden need. But the Archbishop they kept still within the city, for he was of the company of the Tower, or at the least so they thought of him. And of churches they made no account, but left them there, yet for the hope of paradise there were many that went pilgrimage. Then they all praised the prince some deal, but of the court they told Ywain such things as men will tell of courts,
and in part he believed them, and in part he believed them not, for in his time he also had told the like and found it otherwise. But this much he heard of Maurice and took it for truth, namely that by old custom none could be prince in Paladore, save that he were a giant of his stature and of his lineage. And also must no prince take a wife, save that she likewise came of giants, to the end that the same estate and goodliness might remain unto their children's children. And by this counsel, said Maurice, it came to pass that being no more of one kind with smaller folk, he that was prince could not have ado with his people, neither in battle nor in love. But he had of them great reverence, for all men praised the doing of his lineage in time past. Moreover, upon high days there would go lords before him, bearing a great sword and a crown of tourney, and when they of Paladore saw the prince accompanied therewith, there was then no renown that they would not believe of him. So said Maurice, and Bartholomew laughed and said further: It is true enough, yet this also is true, that our prince is no free man, but lives in durance all his life days. For by no old custom, but belike by fear of his greatness, it is forbidden that he come abroad into the city without he be guarded by armed guards, lest perchance he should sometime break forth and go his own ways. Moreover, it is provided that in his own house also, and whether he be eating or drinking or what else doing, he shall in any case be bound with chains. And in the making of such chains they of Paladore have great skill, for they will tie a man hand and foot with bonds of no seeming substance, and yet past breaking of any, save he be strongly holpen of friends. Then Dennis laughed also, and he said: Nay, but this one thing you have forgotten, how that our princes have leave for all manner of hunting and fowling, and they go freely into all such forests as are large enough, and strike all such game as shall come near enough. For though they ride not with hounds, lest their horses fall down under so great weight, yet will they stand in coverts the day long with marvellous endurance, to shoot at such few birds and beasts as may be driven forth to them. And this is well done, for in Paladore good hunting brings good will, and the prince thereby has the love of all his people. And their love fails not, but increases continually, for they hold this prince that now is to be better than his father, and he also was better, as it is reported, than any that was before him. And certainly in the old time they killed not their game so easily, nor 1/4 part of the number thereof. Then said Ywain: I perceive plainly that this is a good prince, but I am yet to seek wherefore he should desire my presence. And Hubert and Maurice and Bartholomew and Dennis, when they heard Ywain say so, they were astonished, for they knew not of the sending of Sir Rainald, and they ceased from their laughing as men cast suddenly into fear. And Hubert said: This is of the Tower, for I know their handiwork of old. Then Ywain said merrily: By seeming, I also am a beast of the game. But they four laughed no more, and Ywain perceived that there was no merriness left in them, for they dreaded the favour of the Tower, whereby they might lose their man as soon as they had gained him. And in no long while after Ywain took his leave of them, and he hastened and came to Sir Rainald, for it was time. End of part 6.